Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Kenilworth Union Church for this public affairs event. Thank you all for being here. We live in a time of a rapidly changing religious landscape and a rapidly changing country. And you may have noticed that Protestant churches can be very different from one another. So one day I happened to be at my local library, and there sitting on the new books shelf was Dr. Hollinger's book, Christianity's American Fate. And I picked it up and I began reading it, and it has helped me to not only understand sort of the historical movements of the last century or so and how they've shaped and been shaped by the ecumenical and evangelical movements, which you will hear more about, but they've also helped me to understand Kenilworth Union Church and our kind of unique position as an independent church with a long history and how that long history weaves throughout the history of religion in America. So I am delighted to welcome Dr. David Hollinger, Professor Emeritus at Berkeley, and Katie Lancaster, and they will lead us today in a wonderful conversation. Thank you all for being here. Let us give them a warm welcome.
Well, to start us out, as Christine mentioned, we are in this time of rapid change, and as I read Dr. Hollinger's book, I was struck by how many places the narrative he was telling matches up or gives insight into the story of Kenilworth Union Church. So I'm going to give us a little reminder of Kenilworth Union Church's history and some pieces to the history that I noticed when Julie and I and Christine looked through some of our archives just to map out how our story fit alongside his. And Dr. Hollinger and I have talked a little bit about this. He's been very generous with thinking about who Kenilworth Union Church is, what it means to be Christian on the North Shore, what it means to be part of the Christian community in Chicago. Many of you know Kenilworth Union Church began in 1892 and was founded in part by Joseph Sears, after whom our elementary school is named. Joseph Sears was part of this really fascinating religious tradition called the Swedenborgian tradition, and they have this theological identity which says if we can all trust in God and can love our neighbor, then we should be able to have Christian unity. And his Swedenborgian church that he grew up in, Joseph Sears, that he grew up in the city, was instrumental in working to organize the Parliament of World Religions, which happened a year after Kenilworth Union Church's founding. And so our church has long had an influential eye on global faith, on what it means to be a Christian amid many other religious traditions. We also have been long connected to Christian neighbors around the country. Julie and Christina and I found that in 1929, our financial statements, which you would think would be really boring, actually tell part of the story of Kenilworth Union. We made contributions to the Federal Council of Churches, which is part of what it meant to be unified together as Christians in that particular season. And by the 1950s, if you've been in our sanctuary, you'll notice the stained glass windows all tell the story of many, many different denominations. And those windows were placed around the same time as the World Council of Churches here in that took place in Evanston, where Eisenhower came to speak. So this big event happened in Evanston right as Kenilworth Union Church is thinking about what it means to be a global Christian. And many of you know we had a longtime pastor, Gil Bowen. He was a man who was raised in an evangelical tradition and then trained in a more ecumenical tradition, and he understood that dynamic of his training in relationship to his personal history. He talks about it really profoundly. We have had women in leadership. We have had a relationship with our neighbors of many, many different faiths, including a high density of Jewish families in the North Shore. So maybe 30% of the Glencoe population is Jewish, even now. And so if you have kids that you've raised, maybe by the time they were in 8th grade, they were had gone to 13, 14, 20, 25 bar mitzvahs or bar mitzvahs. So what it means to be a Christian in relationship to others has really always been central to people at Kenilworth Union. Science and faith in harmony, a deep longing for an ethical response to the suffering of the world, to make the world a better place. So all of these things that make Kenilworth Union Church what it is, and that have really been part of the texture of being this church, line up with what Dr. Hollinger has been looking at in terms of what religion in America looks like today and what it's looked like over the last century and a half, maybe. Yes? So that's as much as I'm going to say about all of that. And I'm going to let you take the reins here and tell us a little bit about what you call ecumenical Protestantism and what that has meant in America.
For somebody like me that has been studying and writing about the so-called mainline, ecumenical liberal Protestantism and its place in modern American history, for somebody like me that's been studying that and writing about it, it's a special pleasure to visit this church. The reasons that Katie has been describing are very striking, and the fact that you've got these stained glass windows about different denominations, that you've got ministers that were raised Presbyterian and are ordained in the Methodists, that you've got a senior pastor who is alleged actually went to Wheaton, God save the mark. I mean, this is this is really ecumenical, and the more that I learn about this congregation, I'm aware that it has succeeded in fulfilling a vision that many of the leaders of this liberal Protestant ecumenical tradition had in the 1960s that failed almost everywhere else. This was an outfit, an initiative that was called the Council on Church Union, and it was especially advanced by Eugene Carson Blake of the National Council of Churches, the successor to the Federal Council of Churches that Katie mentioned a while ago. Now, the idea that the leaders had of the National Council of Churches, that the Congregationalists, this was before the UCC, the Congregationalists, the Methodists, the Northern Presbyterians, the Northern Baptists, the Disciples, maybe some of the Lutheran groups, maybe ECLA, would be able to come together as a single national Protestant church. Denominationalism, these characters thought, Blake and Bishop Pike and others, denominationalism was just a mistake. Now, they'd all read a book by H. Richard Niebuhr, Reinhold's brother, The Sources of Denominationalism, published in 1929. This was the standard reading for everybody that went to seminary all the way through the 1930s, 40s, and 1950s. It explained how the social processes of modern Europe and North America had generated all these denominations in the United States. And the idea was, look, this is a mistake. The gospel is one. We ought to be able to get together and do Christianity well with each other's help. Now, so this was the line that they kept pressing in the late 60s and the early 70s. Now, what happens is that the idea goes out to each of the denominational polities, each of the governances, the boards of the different denominations, the national assemblies of the denominations. So in 1969, 70 and 71, everyone rejected it. Everyone rejected it. Now, one of the things that the liberal Protestant leaders learned from this experience is that the dynamics of intimacy and belonging that are so important to congregational success are often linked to practices, to doctrines, to traditions that are local and denominational. And one after another of these denominational boards and their local pastors, but particularly the small town and rural pastors felt strongly about this. The big guys for getting all together were mostly from the cities. I mean, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, and so forth. So there was a great conflict within liberal Protestants about this. And you might say the provincials won. The provincials won, and I use that word not in a pejorative way, but I mean the people who were willing to pay the bills for keeping the local churches going. These people said, we do not want to be merged. We Presbyterians do not want to be confused with the disciples, so forth. Now, this is a very interesting episode in ecumenical Protestantism. Now, when I talk about ecumenical Protestantism, I think that's a better term than what we usually see in the press and what is often used indeed by church people themselves. Usually it's called mainline. Okay. Now, the problem with mainline is that there's no religious content to it. And it comes mostly from the understanding that most of the people in these churches were upper middle class and above. So it's a class position that is referred to as mainline. Now, the term ecumenical refers to what was really at issue. Many of the people in these congregations and their leadership wanted unity and wanted people to be able to cooperate across denominational lines and even across religious lines. So the term ecumenical, I think, is more accurate. And it's something that is also displayed in the public behavior of these leaders. And a very interesting example of this is in 1945, when the United Nations is founded. The ecumenical Protestants were very prominent in the meeting in San Francisco to establish this. They had 5 or 6 amendments to the Charter of the United Nations that passed. They passed because of the excellent lobbying of Eugene Nolde, a great Lutheran figure of the time, cooperating with the American Jewish Committee. So the liberal Jews and the liberal Protestants worked together to create a United Nations charter that was genuinely universal. Now, they had a terrific fight with the British and Dutch delegates to the United Nations. They wanted to guarantee in the UN Charter the right to proselytize. Now, the American liberal Protestants opposed that on the grounds that if the United Nations did that, it would be an insult to the Muslims, the Buddhists, the Hindus, people of other religions. Now, that's what I mean by an ecumenical approach. These liberal Protestants wanted the United Nations to be a basis for cooperation, not only between different kinds of Christians, but different kinds of religious people, and indeed non-religious. So that one of the great moments in that meeting is when several of the liberal Protestants stand down the Brits and the Dutch, who were still involved in colonial enterprise. Now, the American liberal Protestants, the mainline Protestants of the 1940s and 50s, were conspicuous in global Christianity for their opposition to colonialism and imperialism. So they were very eloquent on this matter throughout that period. So I'm saying that you have a prominent ecumenical Protestant tradition that's especially important in American public life in the 1930s, 40s, and 1950s. And it culminates at the end of the 60s and the early 70s in this idea about why can't we all get this together? And the striking thing about the Kenilworth Church is that you guys seem to have actually done it. I think that's an amazing triumph and something of historical significance I was not aware of you guys at all. I want to say that nearby, though, one of the leaders in this ecumenical movement that I have been describing was at a great Methodist preacher in Evanston. And I'm just sort of curious whether, I've written his name, but make sure I got it right. Yeah, it's Ernest Fremont Tittle. And I want to know if there are people here who've heard of him. How many people have heard of Ernest Fremont Tittle? Well, okay, just a couple, but that's something. Well, all right. Yeah, see, the Presbyterians don't have to know about it, only Methodists, right? So what happens is that Tittle is one of the guys who's leading this whole movement that I'm talking about and present in all the national committees that set this up. And it's always been interesting to me to hear about him because when my dad was in seminary here in Chicago in the early 40s, where I was born when he was at Bethany Theological Seminary down near Garfield Park, he used to, on some Sundays, he would actually come up to Evanston to hear the great Ernest Fremont Tittle, who's such a really famous preacher of the time. Second only, I would say, to Harry Emerson Fosdick, the great radio preacher of the liberal Protestant preachers at that time. Now, on this whole ecumenical thing, I want to emphasize something that is a foundation for it historically that seems to me insufficiently recognized to this day. And this speaks to particularly the witness, shall we say, against colonialism. And that is that the ecumenical movement was very much promoted by the Foreign Missionary Project. So, back about 1900, 1910, 1915, so forth, all of these churches, including my ancestral tribe, the Church of the Brethren, which I'm glad to see is represented here by a friend from Elgin, all of these churches had these huge missionary projects. They send people to China and Japan and India and Africa, South Seas, all over the place. And the idea, of course, to put it crudely, was to make them more like us. Well, they talked a lot about Christ being separate from culture, but of course we know that Christ and culture have a way of getting pretty closely connected. And so this was an effort to spread world Christianity. But what happens to all these Congregationalists and Presbyterians and Brethren and Mennonites and so forth? They get to know a lot of the Chinese people. They get to know a lot of the Indians. They get to know a lot of the Japanese. And not all of them, but a remarkable number of them decide that what these people need is not to become carbon copies of the Methodist Church of Dubuque, Iowa, that they need something else. We have something we can help them. We need to turn more into service projects, and we need to cooperate with them so that they can achieve a greater spirituality and social justice within their own cultures. Now, this was controversial back home. So it's very common for these missionaries to come back from time abroad and say you go into a Presbyterian church in Terre Haute, Indiana, and you remember all those Sunday nights when the missionaries would come back and show slides of where they were and talk so forth and so forth. So then somebody stands up in the audience and says something like, "We did not send you to China to come back here and tell us how interesting the Chinese are." So there are tensions about this, and much of the fundamentalist movement, which we always associate with anti-Darwinism and evolution and all that, actually the fundamentalists were more upset with the liberal Protestant missionary theory than they were with evolution. We don't talk about that much anymore because in the popular press, everybody understands Darwinism. Missionary theory, oh, well, that's too esoteric. Missionary theory was an extremely big deal. Now, one of the reasons it's such a big deal is that a lot of these missionaries that come back, and especially the missionary children, they become very prominent deprovincializers. They become very prominent prophets for cosmopolitanism. Pearl Buck, for example, comes back from China and writes all these books. Okay, this is Nobel Prize stuff. Pulitzer Prize. Pearl Buck did more to change Western attitudes toward China than anyone since Marco Polo. So this is historically big stuff. Now, when we go and read Pearl Buck now, you go back and read The Good Earth in 1932, well, you see Orientalism in it, and, well, she doesn't think quite the way we do now. Okay, but in 1932, this was radical stuff. She tried to make Americans understand Chinese peasants as real human beings. And there were similar things amongst these other missionaries. Now, this was very threatening. Pearl Buck was almost thrown out of various Presbyterian congregations because of the statements that she was making about this in the mid-1930s. She eventually left the church altogether. Another example that's very interesting is John Hersey, Hiroshima, 1945, 1946, okay? John Hersey is a missionary child. He grew up actually in China, not Japan, but he writes this book that enables people to see the Japanese as full human beings. Now, to understand what an incredible contribution this was, this is in 1946, Americans are still very aware of the Bataan Death March. They're very aware of how many millions of Chinese peasants were killed by the Japanese army, to say nothing of Pearl Harbor, all right? So the bases for being really upset with the Japanese is great. Now, what John Hersey does is to leave out everything except 5 individuals and how they were affected by the Hiroshima bomb. And it's a profound book to this day. The last time they did a journalist survey, it was agreed to be the most important piece of journalism in the last 150 years. So John Hersey's Hiroshima, very important example of this missionary experience. So I'm going on about this because I don't think that very many people understand the power of the missionary project as a boomerang, okay? You go abroad, you're going to change things over there, but your experience is expanded. So you come back and you're a critical voice in your own society. So not everybody appreciated it, but a lot of people did. Now, just to add a little bit on this, and then I'll stop on this group, I want to say that the ecumenical Protestants establish a very strong presence in American public life by bringing out certain themes in the gospel and not others, okay? What are the big themes? Matthew 25, Matthew 30, 35, 25, 30, somebody knows this. I was naked and you clothed me. I think it's Matthew 25. Yeah. Parson, is that right? Yeah, okay. So then, Sermon on the Mount. Okay, then there's, let me see if I can get, Galatians 3:28. In Christ there is no male or female, Gentile or Jew, so forth. Good Samaritan. All right. Now these are basic texts in a lot of liberal Protestant preaching. They did not make a big deal of Paul's views about women in churches. They did not make a big deal about Paul's statements about sexuality. I mean, that was there, but if you look at what goes on in a lot of, the fundamentalist and evangelical churches, it's a different set of priorities as to where the scriptures is. Now, of course, a lot of people like to think that the scriptures are a whole, and that there's a single message there. It all fits together. Well, okay, that's a theological position. I mean, one could try to defend that. But historians are very aware of how differently Christianity instructed different groups, times, and places. And within that history, this liberal Protestant presence that I'm talking about, which apotheosis in the United States between about 1930 and about 1970 is a very distinctive episode. That's a long answer to your question. I'll stop.
That's great. That's you've brought us up to speed to 1970. What? Tell me a little bit more about that's. Ecumenical Protestantism is not the only game in town.
Yeah.
So tell me more about is it the opposition? Is it a neighboring theological identity? How would you describe?
There are the fundamentalist movement of the teens and 20s and 30s, which we associate especially with the Scopes trial. And okay, that's easy to understand, has a number of objections to this drift on the part of the liberals during the 20s and 30s, which is already pronounced. They particularly do not like the interests of the liberals in what used to be called the higher criticism, or the historical study of the Bible. The fundamentalists were very suspicious of, for example, if you allowed that Isaiah was written by two and possibly three guys, and over many centuries, you get to Isaiah 55, and those of you that have read it will understand that something's really different going on. Isaiah 40, Isaiah 55 are very sharp breaks. Now, the fundamentalists did not want to hear any of this, but the liberals were very big on this. So Fosdick was always, preaching on the radio about Isaiah. Now, that was something that they objected to, and they objected to the missionary theory, and they objected to the responsiveness to science. So what happens in 1942 is that a group of fundamentalist leaders, led by a guy named Harold Ockenga, or it looks like Okenga, but he pronounced it Ockenga, Dutch, of Boston, they established the National Association of Evangelicals in 1942. The whole point of the National Association of Evangelicals is to fight the Federal Council of Churches and to fight Harry Emerson Fosdick, who was cordially hated by a lot of these fundamentalist leaders. Now, they adopt the term evangelical as a substitute for fundamentalist for several reasons. Partly it's more capacious. Also, it's not as much stigma. It doesn't have, they were eager to escape the notions of narrowness that were associated with the term fundamentalism. By calling themselves the National Association of Evangelicals, they appropriate a term, a concept that used to be much more wide in Protestantism. It used to be the evangelicalism applied to any effort to bring other people to the faith, okay? So what happens after 1942 is that the concept of evangelicalism is increasingly seized by these ex-fundamentalists who are also branching out to embrace Pentecostals. Now, the original fundamentalists were very text-oriented, not much Holy Spirit. But they, by the end of the 1940s, there are many rapports with Pentecostal groups. Now, this outfit of conservative Protestants in their opposition to the liberals established a series of institutions. And I'm going to talk about some of these institutions. But the basic insight throughout all of this is that we should understand evangelicalism as a presence in modern America right down to the present day. We should understand it as a protest movement against liberal ecumenical Protestantism. Evangelicalism is not something that has its own engines and its own propulsion. Evangelicalism achieves definition as a protest movement against the cosmopolitan initiatives of the liberal Protestants. Now, the founding of the NEA in 1942 is the first of these institutions. The second is Fuller Theological Seminary in California, founded to go against Union Theological Seminary in New York and the Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, especially. A very explicitly effort to counteract these people. Third, Christianity Today, magazine founded in 1956 by Billy Graham and wealthy capitalists that he was connected with. Now, Christianity Today is designed to beat back the Christian Century, which is the house organ of the liberal Protestant ecumenical mainline establishment. And if you read the correspondence between Graham and these other people that were behind this, and particularly very wealthy anti-New Deal corporation people who were behind this, we've got to stop. We've got to stop the New Deal. We've got to stop this regulatory state. And the great thing about evangelicalism is that it's based on personal salvation rather than social stuff. So we need to get back to individuality. So Graham and his friends bankroll this. Now, this is in the middle of disputes. This is right after Brown v. School Board. And the first issue of Christianity Today, and the documents that historians have found, establish all of this, they're trying to decide whether they're for segregation or against it. Are we really going to support Brown v. School Board, or are we not? The first article in Christianity Today about this supports Jim Crow. Now that changed pretty quickly, okay? That was really, they figured out that this was not the future for them. So Christianity Today gradually over the next few years changes on that. But really right down through the early 60s, Christianity Today is saying that the liberal Protestants are communist dupes. And the editor of Christianity Today, as late as, I'm not sure about this particular thing, I think as late as about 1962 or 63, says that he has a list of liberal Protestant preachers that are communist members at this moment. Okay, so this is very heavy McCarthyite stuff. Christianity Today is not entirely defined by that, all right? But that really distinguishes it from the Christian Century, because the Christian Century is supporting Martin Luther King. So what the liberals, they are, who was the big darling of the liberals? Howard Thurman, great black preacher. Martin Luther King is a liberal Protestant standard issue. He goes to Boston, he studies with Harold DeWolf, the great liberal theologian. And so he comes out of that tradition. Now, the National Association of Evangelicals was still holding its national conventions in cities that would not guarantee that black delegates could be served by the hotels. Whereas as early as 1940, the Federal Council of Churches would not hold its conventions at places where the black delegates would not be treated equally. As a result, all the FCC conferences are only in two places, Philadelphia and I forget what the other one was now, but it's Cleveland, Philadelphia and Cleveland, okay. Now they tried to meet in Chicago, but as late as 1944-45, the Chicago Hotel Association would not guarantee that the black delegates would be treated equally. Now, this is quite a crisis. I mean, I've read that the Presbyterian Historical Society archives in Philadelphia are really magnificent on this. You see the letters back and forth of people like Ernest Fremont Tittle and A.J. Musty and Fosdick and Reinhold Niebuhr. And what are we going to do about this segregation stuff? The evangelicals are doing this all the time. So they choose their cities on a racial liberal ground. So what I really want to emphasize is that evangelical Protestantism flourishes as a safe harbor for people who want to be counted as full Christians without confronting two challenges that the liberal Protestants said the gospel demands that we confront in the United States in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Two challenges. The first, we live in a scientifically literate culture. Science is very important. We've got to deal with this. Second, we live in a demographically diverse society. We've got to deal with this. So there's cognitive and demographic components to this. Now, Billy Graham, when he starts all his stuff in the late 40s and down through the 50s, which of course gives fits to the liberal Protestant leaders, Billy Graham offers the gospel pure and simple. What does that mean? Oh, you don't have to worry about demographic diversification. You don't have to worry about civil rights. You don't have to worry about any of that, because racism, it's a terrible thing, but it's a disease of the human heart. We must wait for the human heart to change. Billy Graham said this over and over again, even though after he integrated his his audience, his rallies. This is a problem of the human heart. And also, you can be a real Christian without worrying too much about this science stuff. So let's not be elaborate about this. Let's just go with the basics. Now, this is a tremendously effective thing. So Graham brings in these people, and this is, you can read the correspondence of these poor Presbyterian and Methodist pastors in like 1957, 1962. They're complaining. Well, you know, a lot of people in our congregations are going to these Billy Graham rallies. Has he got something that we don't have? Well, maybe he did. You can argue about what he had. But I'm telling you, one thing that Billy Graham had that was really important is that you could be a full-bore Christian without confronting those two challenges, that we live in an ethno-racially diverse society and that we live in a scientifically informed culture. Now this goes on, and the Republican Party in the late 50s and 60s observes that this is going on, and some of their richest people, like Howard Pugh, Pugh, by the way, financed Christianity Today almost out of nothing, and he sponsored Christianity Today sent to every pastor in the United States free. So as a result, Christianity Today had a much greater circulation than Christian Century from the start, and it promoted that all the way. But the thing about the Republican Party in that tradition, they're aware of this. The leaders of the Republican Party are not particularly evangelical or particularly religious. Many of them are actually liberal Protestants. But what happens then is they develop this Southern strategy. We've all heard about that the Republicans, particularly Reagan, but also Goldwater and Nixon, are aware that many of the voters in the Southern states that are uncomfortable with the advancing of civil rights and especially voting rights for black people, these folks, traditionally Democratic voters, could be won over to the Republican Party if we appeal to them. And Goldwater is very aware of this as early as '64. And Nixon is explicit on this. We have confidants of Nixon that describe these meetings where he said, listen, you don't need the Eastern Corridor and you don't need California. All you need is the South, the Midwest, and Ohio. So this is calculated. They know exactly what they're doing. Reagan is especially concerned about this. Reagan begins the 1980 presidential campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, standing on the graves of the great martyrs of Neshoba County. He stands on those graves and he advocates states' rights. Nobody had any misunderstanding where he was on that. A few weeks later, he gives a speech to the National Convention of the National Association of Evangelicals. This is what he said, cleverly. I know you can't endorse me, but I endorse you. Thunderous applause. So he cements the connection there. Now, an aspect of the Southern strategy, which is not recognized sufficiently, I think, to the present day, is that the states that are relevant to the Southern strategy are also the states that have the highest percentage of evangelical Protestants and the lowest educational level. So the Republican Party, spinning off of this Southern strategy, finds itself increasingly captured, you might say, by its evangelical clients and their dubious engagement with modern standards for epistemic plausibility. So the Republican Party believes that it can get by without attending to higher education voters. Now, this is a gradual process that goes on in the late 20th and the early 21st century. But what happens then by 2016 if you look at the 32 senators that represent the Eastern Corridor states and the Pacific states of California, Washington, Oregon, and Hawaii, of those 32 senators, only 2 were Republicans. Toomey of Pennsylvania, Collins of Maine. So now what has happened gradually during that time is that the Republican Party, which had produced senators and governors of real stature, remember Earl Warren, there are a lot of other examples that we could give, that party had decided that it didn't need high-educated voters. Now, who could they count on? The Republican Party learns that there's one group of voters that it can absolutely count on: white evangelical Protestants. White evangelical Protestants in the southern states and out in the Midwest and in the mountains. So gradually, the Republican Party finds itself dependent on this particular bunch of voters. Now, many of the Republican leaders aren't particularly interested in religion, but from a strictly calculating point of view, boy, these are people you can really count on. So gradually developed, so that that's the situation in politics that we have today is has this religious connection. I mean, we live in a time when the society as a whole is becoming more and more secular. We've all read these stories about, 30% no longer religiously affiliated, and as early as 1990, it was only like 7 or 8%. So that's a big change. So the society as a whole is becoming more secular, relatively speaking, but yet we have an increasingly religious politics. Now that's an astounding paradox if you think about it. A society that gets more and more secular and its politics gets more and more religious. I think it's also safe to say that we now have, for the first time in all American history, a major political party with a vested interest in keeping the education level of the voters low. And this is revealed by all sorts of things that we see all around us. And it's amazing, from a historian's point of view, this is really unprecedented. Like if you were to list the things that education can make a difference on, the most obvious things, and then you line it up with policies that are now advanced by the Republican Party and by the Democratic Party, well, education enables one to better recognize the arguments for global warming. Education makes it easier to appreciate the value of vaccines. Education makes it easier to understand that the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow has ongoing, abiding consequences for African Americans. Education makes it easier to understand that the lives of women are expanded and enriched by reproductive choice. Education makes it easier to see through some of the notorious deceits of President Trump. Education makes it easier to be suspicious of the QAnon conspiracy stories that are very prominent among Republican voters. So you list a whole series of things, and wait a minute, that's more like the Democrats than like the Republicans. Now this is really unprecedented in American history to have education so connected with one party rather than another. And that's a very important and dangerous thing about the society at the present time. So I've talked about the evangelicals. I want to emphasize that this is a movement against liberals, that it's a movement that is then taken under the wing of the Republican Party for indirect and political reasons, and gradually, over time, evangelical becomes more important, not but because of its instrumental value to the Republican Party. And that's a sort of remarkable transition in American life. Anyway, I should stop at that and see if you have something else you want to ask me about.
So in the meantime, right, the kind of importance culturally of American ecumenical Protestants. You brought us up to 1970. Since then, as we've been, watching American Christian life change, we've seen a decline in Methodists, Presbyterians, Disciples, Episcopalians. Kenilworth Union may be an outlier. Probably our peak year was 1996. We baptized 120 people.
You baptized that many?
Yeah, not me. I wasn't. But and then we had this, this group of kids to confirm and all of that in the years after. But that was definitely our peak, was 1996. So we may have bucked some of those trends. What happened to ecumenical Protestantism?
That's just an astonishing thing. It's another way in which this congregation is different. Okay, so what happens then? The membership in these classic liberal Protestant denominations reaches its high point about 1965 to 1967. Public role is maybe not quite as great then as American life. And then from the 60s down through the end of the century and beyond, the membership declines and the public influence declines. There are several things that go on here. The first question that's usually asked about this is, well, don't all these people just switch to the evangelicals? Absolutely not. Some did, okay? Some did. But all our statistically oriented sociologists are very adamant that this is just a tiny, tiny basis for the change. Other things are much more important. One is birth rates. Because what happens is that the ecumenical denominations are quicker to welcome women moving into the workforce, and also the use of contraception, and the evangelicals are very reluctant on that. So the birth rate declines in all of these congregations. You can go through the Methodists, the Episcopalians, and so forth, and our statisticians have done quite a lot of work on this. And you see the birth rate declining, and the evangelicals stayed very high. Evangelicals families had more babies even than Catholic families during the baby boom. So that while the liberal Protestants with a stronger class position, more education, and very different attitude toward women and their place in society, birth rate goes down while the evangelicals go up. So that's one thing, the birth rate. So what happened, and it's a kind of snowball effect, because what happens if you have fewer women of childbearing age, and if they have fewer children, then you've really got a quite striking demographic decline. Now, at the same time that our demographers tell us this is a very important thing, you also have unprecedented numbers of young people deciding not to affiliate with the churches of their parents. Now, this is very striking, beginning about 1967, 1968. So young people in earlier generations, okay, they leave the church for a while, but then when they have their own families, they come back in. Not this group. This group, once they leave, they're out. There are a few exceptions to this, all right? But more and more people move out. So what's going on there? Well, partly there are all these social movements of the 60s that attract a lot of attention. And the churches, as you know, are very split by this. So from a lot of the point of view of a lot of the young people, the churches are not moving fast enough to deal with the anti-racist civil rights movement. They're not dealing fast enough to deal with anti-colonialism. They're not dealing fast enough to deal with sexism. And so they move out. They're not sure that they even if they're coming from congregations that have been relatively progressive on that, not moving fast enough. So some folks in the churches claim that the church is moving too fast. They're substituting politics for the gospel, all that. Have a lot of that kind of talk on the one hand. On the other hand, well, we got to move faster. The gospel requires this, or maybe we don't need the gospel at all. So there's a tremendous decline in affiliation with parental congregations. This goes on throughout the 90s and really down into the 20th century, and possibly plateaued only in the last few years. So that's another thing. Now, something else that I think has gotten enough attention. In the 1970s and 80s and after, the mainline churches had a hard time putting ecumenical, the evangelical fundamentalist churches. Now, it used to be that upwardly mobile Nazarenes, upwardly mobile Assembly of God, upwardly mobile Southern Baptists, they would, as the sociologists would say, move up to the Methodists and the Presbyterians and the Lutherans and the Episcopalians. So if you study church growth during the 20 years after World War II, you find that a lot of the growth comes because these people leave the Nazarenes and they go to the Methodists. Now, that stops in the 1980s and after because the success of the evangelicals in organizing and having all of their institutions, having their own universities, their own radio programs, their own TV programs, their own institutions, unprecedented before that generation. This made it possible to be mainstream, going mainline. So it was possible to be a real part of American society. You could be still be an evangelical. And this was, of course, one of the big messages of Billy Graham and Christianity Today. So it used to be that it was sort of hard to be respectable and be an evangelical. And indeed, the liberal Protestants tended to treat evangelicals and fundamentalists as sort of like poor country cousins, that, they're kind of scuzzy. And the fundamentalists understood this and really did not like it. So they developed these counter-institutions, which are very strong. And they continue to be strong even to the present day, despite the fact that they've had a falling off in a lot of their numbers as well. So those things are going on, and and the decline of these churches, and it puts something else that's sort of relevant to this that I guess I've implied, but maybe I should emphasize more directly. Higher education has a lot to do with this. Now, it's not until the 1950s and 60s that lots and lots of Americans went to college. Now, this changes not only with the GI Bill, but with the enormous expansion of American universities after the war, and more families sending their children to college. Now, what difference does that make? Well, all this college education, you meet different kinds of experiences. And it's a little bit like the missionary project. You take a course on Chinese history or European history, it deprovincializes. Now, many of the church ministries are right in the middle of this. There's several interesting studies of these people that run the Baptist ministry for Purdue, or the Presbyterian ministry for Princeton, something like that. And almost all of them have the same kind of experience, that they're trying to maintain a center for the undergraduates at this college of their own denomination. And fewer of them are interested. And so these poor campus pastors are dealing with these kids that come in and say, I just had this terrific course on Hinduism, and I never knew anything about this. And it's not that I'm becoming a Hindu, but in my own church, back in Terre Haute, I mean, I had the impression that Christianity was the whole thing, but there's this whole other stuff out there. So the experience of higher education. Now, higher education is also a place where you encounter in the lives of a lot of these people for the first time free thinkers, especially Jews, especially secular Jews, especially people who are not Christians, okay? So the percentage of Jewish faculty in many of these colleges and disciplines and so forth is actually very high. And it's not that these people are proselytizing and trying to make everybody Jewish or join the temple. That's not it. What it matters is that these are almost, I think the percentage is something like, in 1969 there was a study done of American academics that showed that something like 70% of professors of Jewish ancestry had said that they had abandoned their natal religion. Okay? So these are Jews ethnically, but they are decidedly not Judaic. Now this is important because there's all this stuff about the Judeo-Christian tradition. Okay? Now we need to remember that all the twaddle about the Judeo-Christian tradition, while it sounds inclusive, was also directed against secular Jews. So you make America more comprehensive, you bring Jews into it, so it's not the Christian tradition, it's Judeo-Christian tradition, but there's no place in it for free-thinking Jews. So, but if you look at the media, at the prominent scientists, the prominent entertainers, the prominent physicists, the prominent professors, the prominent novelists, okay, there's a Judaic background, but it's not faith-affirming. That's why I say they're free-thinking Jews. Remember, T.S. Eliot said in 1934 that one thing the United States does not want to have is too many free-thinking Jews. He said this in 1934, even after the Nazi takeover. And he said the reason that this is bad is that it will deprive us of a unified religious and racial culture. So I'm saying, and I'll stop now. I see it's 2:30. I'll say that the Jewish presence is a very important broadening experience for a lot of people that go to college, and this is another reason why the hold of the Christian tradition weakens a little bit. The last point I will make, and then I'll stop. We need to remember when we face what's going on now and the historical trajectory that has led to it. The decline of ecumenical liberal mainline Protestantism has deprived the United States of what was long the most powerful countervailing force against evangelicalism. I'll stop there.
Very good. Thank
So
you.
do we have questions, or what do you want to do?
Can we take 2 questions, 3 questions? Is that okay?
We have a live stream audience, so the questions have to be repeated in the microphone. Any questions? Yes.
First of all, thanks so much for your comments. Secondly, you looked at the decline in church membership from roughly 75 to say today, which is some 50 years. If you have to look at the next 50 years, what's going to be the outcome of this trend?
We historians are very precious about our refusal to predict. Okay. However, I'll take the bait, and I'll put it this way: if you look at current trends, and if you assume that they're not going to be really, really different for the next couple of decades, then it looks like the United States will continue to be more like Britain, Germany, France, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia, which is to say that Christianity will decline in its public role, and there'll be more and more shall we say, post-Protestants, as I like to call them, post-Catholics. But at the same time, there will be a Christianity, a very vibrant, strong Christianity, and it will be right-wing. And it will be closely connected with the Republican Party. So that the trend would be that the Christianity will be increasingly a refuge and an instrument for the most conservative of Americans theologically, culturally, and politically. That's why I say that the decline of the liberals is a very big deal, because it used to be that used to be a huge competition and conversation about what it means to be Christian, okay? But if the liberal voices are down, then the conservative voices dominated. So you look at the Times op-ed page, okay? Nothing there from the old religious establishment. I mean, you get David French and David Brooks and several of the other pundits. These are anti-Trump evangelicals, okay? So they're anti-Trump, but they are not renouncing evangelicalism. So you do not get anybody saying stuff like, well, I hope some of you have seen, the last New Yorker has a very interesting piece by Adam Gopnik on biblical hermeneutics. And I sometimes wonder whether there's any topic that Adam Gopnik doesn't know everything about. But this is an example of perspective on the Bible that you would not get from French or some of these other, I'm trying to remember some of these other guys there, Peter Renner or Russell Moore. So there's a lot of public conversation about Christianity, but the dominant voices are either anti-Trump evangelicals or pro-Trump evangelicals. And one of the remarkable things to me as a historian of this, having looked back in the days of, Harry Emerson Fosdick and John Foster Dulles was one of the great liberal Protestants of the United States, so that the people in really important positions were articulating this. And at least as I look at the Times, what do I read? I read the Times, the Post, and the Atlantic, and I do not see a liberal Protestant voice there. So there's a future for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have time for one more question right here, and then please stick around afterwards if you'd like.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. This is sort of a terrifying conversation, though, because I am a mother of a fourth grader, but also a mother of kids in college, and I have a high school senior. So
send them to Wheaton, they'll be safe.
So the senior, it's my understanding, this is our largest graduating class nationally that will be going to college. I don't know if you've seen those statistics.
I missed out on this.
So that is hopeful, I would think. And what do you recommend as a board member of this church and also the mother of a fourth grader? What can we do to correct this?
That's unfair. I mean,
I could use advice.
The thing I would say that the stuff that I have to offer, whatever it's worth, I'm looking at the world from 30,000 feet, and I think that's valuable because not everybody who writes about this stuff does. Okay. Now, one of the disadvantages of looking at things from 30,000 feet is that you don't see what's going on in local congregations and in local communities. And that's one reason why visiting with you people is so interesting to me, because this is really very down to earth. This is not what I'm accustomed to. And a difficulty with your question also is that so much of that is highly individual. And I think that a universalist answer to a personal question is usually wrong. That doesn't mean that universal principles are not relevant, but all of our lives are so unique, and their uniqueness is something that we should value and treasure and affirm. So, I mean, it may be that was it 4-year-old?
He's 9, fourth grade.
He's 9, oh, fourth grade, okay. Well, I'm trying to think my various grandchildren who are now 16 and 19, and what, I don't know, I guess if I have a principle, I'll try this. The principle would be, teach your young people what you really are. Don't fake it. And I say that because I had a lot of friends drifting away from the faith who went to church because they thought it would be good for their kids. Now, my wife and I, as atheists, we didn't do that. I mean, we didn't sort of tell our children, don't believe in God, that's a lot of nonsense, and forget that Jesus stuff. Never said that. Quite the contrary. Very sympathetic with a lot of people who were believers. But we didn't pretend that. And I was frustrated with some of my friends who went to these Presbyterian churches, and I would ask them, says, I don't believe any of this God and Jesus stuff, but I think it's good for the kids, or I think it's good to have something to revolt against. So insofar, now I'm speaking personally because I want to take your question seriously and give you an honest answer, but the best that I could do would be something like that, tell them what you believe.
Thank
Okay?
you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, David Hollinger. Thank you, Katie Lancaster. And please stick around for a cup of coffee and the opportunity to meet our esteemed speaker. Thank you for coming.